Well, good morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here. Want to remind you, Easter's coming this Sunday, so who are you bringing with you? Who have you invited to attend Easter with you? Relatives? Yes. Neighbors? Work associates? Classmates? Who are you bringing to worship with you on Easter Sunday here at First Baptist? Pray about it and bring people with you. Today in our devotion, we are in John chapter 4. And what I wrote at the top of my journal after reading this chapter is the value of systematic Bible reading. As you know, we are reading the Bible systematically. We have our Bible reading plan. And so we're not just cherry picking. We're not just saying, well, where's the Bible open to today? And I'll read there. We're doing it in a very systematic way. And God is using it to change hundreds of lives. And this chapter for me illustrates the value of that, from having a more holistic, fuller understanding of God's Word. In this chapter, Jesus is passing through Samaria. He's traveling from Jerusalem to the south, to Galilee toward the north. And so to get there, he passes through Samaria. Sits down to rest at Jacob's well, has a conversation with a woman from Samaria whose life had not been an easy life, probably not a morally upright life. But he has a conversation with her, and it becomes a gospel conversation, a spiritual conversation, and it turns to worship. And at one point in the conversation, starting at verse 19, the woman said to Jesus, excuse me, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet." And then she added, "Our fathers, our ancestors, worshiped in this mountain, and you people," referring to the Jews, "say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." What's going on there? What's she talking about? Well, you may remember that in January this year, we read in the book of 1 Kings and some passages in 2 Kings, the history of the nation of Israel, because following the death of Solomon, the third king of Israel, the nation experienced a civil war. We read all about that and talked about that back in January and into February. And the first king of what became the northern kingdom, remember the southern kingdom was normally referred to as Judah and its capital was Jerusalem. The northern kingdom was referred to as Israel most of the time, and its capital was later Samaria, but in the beginning it wasn't Samaria. And so two countries, and the first king in the north was a general named Jeroboam. And he was afraid the people, you'll remember, would start traveling to Jerusalem to worship at the temple that Solomon had built. And to keep them from going to Jerusalem, because he wanted them to be loyal to this new country, to his dynasty to the north, he created these two golden calves and put one at a religious shrine in Bethel and another at a religious shrine in Dan. And they ordained, if you will, people who were not Levites to be priests. So basically created a idolatry, a false religion, and the people began worshiping there. Well, that's all recorded in 1 Kings 12, and we read that in January. You get over to 1 Kings 16, which we also read in January. It's about 100 years after the Civil War. There's a king in the north named Omri, and he buys this elevated location, this elevated hill, because he's going to make it the new permanent capital of the northern kingdom. And he builds his palace, he builds the capital there, and he names that elevated area that he had bought for the new capital, names it Samaria. And that became the capital of the northern kingdom. And in the years after that, the northern kingdom was referred to sometimes as Israel, but at other times as Samaria. Same name as the capital city, where he built shrines for them to worship the pagan god Baal and other forms of idolatry. And so in the ensuing centuries, the people of Samaria said, "This is the mountain where we worship." And the Jews said, "No, it's Jerusalem." Remember, Jerusalem was the capital of the southern kingdom, because David made it the capital of the whole nation before the Civil War. And Jerusalem was also on an elevated hill, and they liked building cities on elevated locations because they were easier to defend. And the elevated hill that Jerusalem was built on included the location where in the book of Genesis, Isaac had prepared to sacrifice his son, or Abraham had prepared to sacrifice his son Isaac until God stopped him. Okay, where God tested Abraham. That location where that happened is the same location as the hill on which Jerusalem is built, and the same mount, the same place where the temple was built. And so the debate, Jerusalem, well, that's where God told the Jewish people to build their temple. But the Samaritans, with their idolatry, created a competing hill, a competing place of worship. That's what this woman in Samaria talking to Jesus is talking about. My ancestors have all said, this mountain is where we're supposed to worship, but you people, the Jews, say, no, it's Jerusalem. Well, Jerusalem was the place. But I want you to know, so that's the history lesson, and that's why systematic Bible reading is important, because you're able to tie these things together, and suddenly what's going on makes more sense. But if you just, well, where the Bible falls open today, that's where I'm going to read, you're never going to learn God's Word the way you need to. This systematic approach to reading God's Word is 1,000 times better than any other approach. Now, I want us to notice, though, after that Bible history lesson, if you will, what Jesus said about worship. So she brings up the subject of which mountain. And Jesus said to her in verse 21, "Woman, believe me, an hour is coming when neither in this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father." A time's coming when which mountain no longer matters. He said, now, right now, in verse 22, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. He's basically saying what your ancestors did up here was wrong. But, having said that, in verse 23, an hour is coming and now is. It's actually here, really in Jesus. He brought it. An hour is coming and now is when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such people the Father seeks to be His worshipers. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship Him in spirit and truth. In other words, the building doesn't matter. The property, the address, doesn't matter. What matters is, are you worshiping God in truth and spirit? Truth meaning the right belief that you actually obey, and spirit, your heart, your soul, your mind, your attitude. Now, that's not an argument for not going to church, because the Bible in many places talks about the importance of us worshiping collectively, as a body of believers, as a family. But what Jesus is saying, worship is not dependent on Jerusalem or that mountain in Samaria. Worship has to do with your knowing the truth of God and obeying and living the truth of God, and you worshiping God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and with all your strength. Address is not as important as those things are. And that's the word for today. I'll see you tomorrow as we wrap up this week and get ready for Easter Sunday. God bless you, everybody.